Does anybody else feel like June was simultaneously the shortest and the longest month possible? Like May feels like 10 minutes but also 10 years ago, and I don't know how that happens, but apparently it does. Hi everyone, my name's Chloe. Welcome back to my channel. Thank you for being here today. Today's video is going to be a wrap up of everything that I read during the month of June during Whateverthon. I'm sure you're sick of hearing me talk about that by now, but this video is going to have sort of every book that I read, quick thoughts on them all, a little bit of more information on stats and things like that. And yeah, let's just collect it all in one place, have a little bit of a chat about how I got on during the month of June. So let's stop the ramble and let's start talking about the books. So I read a grand total of 12 books during the month. I was aiming for 10, so I'm really happy with getting to 12. I read all contemporary. I was on Camp Contemporary and I wanted to stick in that genre. And I also gave myself the challenge of reading all LGBTQ plus fiction during the month. So every book that I read had some sort of substantial queer character in it, be it the main character or a substantial side character. And yeah, I'm happy to report that I finished that challenge as well. So lots of queer fiction to talk about today. I know that's what you want to hear about, is what books I actually read, so let's get on to that bit now. So I started the month by reading one of my most anticipated reads of this year. It was on my 5-star predictions video. I've actually got a couple of books on here that were on my 5-star predictions video and had some mixed results with them. But the first one that I read was Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid. You'll notice I don't actually have the book here, I just have the dust cover because my mum's reading this one at the minute. So this one basically centres around a family. It's a group of siblings who live in Malibu, as the name would suggest, and they are the sons and daughters of a famous singer, but they haven't necessarily had the sort of best relationship with him growing up. Basically every year they throw this big sort of party that's become kind of iconic in the area of Malibu, and it gets bigger and bigger every year. And this year, all you know from the sort of synopsis going into it is that by the end of the night the house will have burnt down, and you don't quite know how. That to me sounded like it was going to be very sort of, I don't know, I expected this party to be really sort of over the top and really just like going crazy, and there was elements of that, but it's not really what the story's about. The party doesn't start happening until I think about 2/3 into the book. A lot of it is actually just about this family and their relationships, and to be honest I don't know why I didn't expect that going into it, because Taylor Jenkins Reid's books are very, very character driven, and that's actually why I love her books, and that is why I gave this one 5 stars. I really enjoyed all of the sort of, you had flashbacks to the family, both the siblings themselves, but also in how their parents met and sort of grew together and grew apart at times as well. And it was just, I don't really know how else to describe it without sort of going into too in-depth thoughts on the storyline that would spoil it for people, but I just really enjoyed the sort of dynamics between everyone in here. I can understand why some people wouldn't necessarily love it if you were going in for something that was a little bit more sort of action-packed, or I don't know, because there's not really too much that happens. It's a fairly simple story, but I just, yeah, really, really enjoyed it and made me remember why I love Taylor Jenkins Reid's writing style once again. So yeah, a 5 stars, and I was very, very happy that it was 5 stars because yeah, 5-star prediction, starting off strong. And then a quick thing as well, just for anyone who was wanting to know a little bit more about how I use this for Whateverthon. So this does feature an LGBTQ plus character. I'm not going to say too much more about that because it's kind of part of the storyline, because sort of what their identity is and how that sort of brought into the story would kind of spoil it a little bit, but I will say that it is a part of the storyline, so I counted it as that. It also covered 3 prompts, so it was a 5-star prediction, as I've already mentioned. I hauled it in the past year, and it was also a buddy read. I joined one of the groups on the Discord to chat about it. I next went on to read Veronica Comics by Jennifer Duggan. So I've been wanting to read one of Jennifer Duggan's books for a while, but just hadn't got around to it, couldn't quite decide which one to pick up. But then one of the prompts was to read a bookish creator's favourite, and I know that this was actually on Maddie, who created the Whateverthon. It was on her favourites list from last year, I believe. So I decided what better time than now to pick this one up. This tells the story of 2 teenagers who are the son and daughter of sort of rival comic book businesses. One of them runs a sort of indie publishing company and runs a indie comic book store, and then one of them runs a big sort of conglomerate type company that isn't necessarily treating the indie store that well. And basically they meet at a comic book convention, hit it off quite quickly, but they don't actually know that they are sort of the sons and daughters of sort of the rival companies until further on in the story. And there's a lot more to it than that, but I'm not going to say too much more. If you've watched any of my wrap-ups before, you know that I tend to go into books fairly blind, so I'm not going to give you too much of a synopsis. But what I will say is that I thought going into this book that it was more just a sort of fluffy contemporary story. It really isn't. It's actually about the boy character in this, Ridley, is struggling a lot with anxiety, and that is a lot of what this story is about. I will say that it's quite a sort of full-on depiction of someone who is struggling with their mental health, and maybe just be wary of it if you are maybe not feeling in the best place yourself. It might not be necessarily the thing that you're wanting to pick up at the minute. I definitely wish that I would have known some of the trigger warnings for it before I read it, so I would recommend having a look up sort of more in-depth things about trigger warnings if you are worried that it's going to be something that might affect you a little bit. I did really enjoy it though. I gave it 4 stars. It wasn't quite sort of like a new all-time favourite, but I really enjoyed it, hence the 4 rather than the 5. And yeah, I'll definitely be picking up more from Jennifer Duggan in the future. Hopefully I'll just carry on loving her books. And the prompts that this fit for Whatever You Wantathon obviously is contemporary. It is LGBTQ because although it is a male-female romance, that is a romance between 2 characters who identify as bisexual. It also fits a number of other prompts, and the ones that I chose to use it for were mental health representation, a bookish creator's favourite, and it was also on fulfilling a TBR prompt because it was on my TBR mash last month. The next book that I read was another one that was on my 5-star predictions video, and that was Me, My Dad and the End of the Rainbow by Benjamin Dean. So up front I will say that unfortunately this one wasn't a 5-star. The reason being is that I did really enjoy this book, but I am remembering why I don't read a ton of middle grade. I find it hard to read from a younger character sometimes. The sort of voice of a younger character I do find a little bit hard to sort of get into and to push myself to read a lot. So whilst I really, really enjoyed the story, it is just something about being a middle grade and therefore not being written for my age group. I'm not the target audience for this, and yeah, I loved it, and it'll be great for people who are the target audience, but it just wasn't a sort of new favourite for me because I think it would have to take something very special for a middle grade to end up getting 5 stars from me. So now we've got the slight negative out of the way. One of the things that I absolutely loved about this book is just sort of the discussions that it was having and the fact that it exists for younger readers. Things like this, books like this, I don't remember ever seeing when I was a kid, and just books that sort of celebrate LGBTQ plus people and are available for younger readers to sort of get to know about all the different sort of identities and things that are out there in the world. I loved it. So for anyone who doesn't know the story of this one, it basically follows a character called Archie, and his parents have split up and he doesn't quite know why, and then he finds out that his dad is gay, and he ends up finding a flyer for Pride in his dad's pocket, and that kind of inspires him to decide to travel to Pride with his friends. No adults, not the best idea, but he decides to travel there to sort of find out what is happening in his dad's life and what sort of changes that might mean for him in his life. And it was just a really sort of lovely story about sort of Archie finding out what this is going to mean for him going forward and how sort of his dad is still his dad, essentially. And like I said, I really enjoyed it for what it was. I gave it 4 stars. It was a very good read, and I'm very happy that this exists. So for the Whatever You Wantathon prompts, I put this one down as LGBTQ plus, obviously. This is the only one that technically wasn't in my teen genre. It is contemporary, it is a contemporary story, but I couldn't count it as contemporary on the tracker because it is also middle grade and therefore belongs to the middle grade monarchs, not to camp contemporary. But it still sort of fit for my goal of wanting to read contemporary stories throughout the month. And it also fit the prompts of cover that reminds you of a pride flag, because I mean there's rainbows all over that, but then also on the inside cover that is a pride flag. It is also a book out of my comfort zone because, as I said, I don't read a lot of middle grade, and it's also an author's debut as well. Next, I went on to do a reread of a favourite from last year, and that was Felix Ever After by Caitlin Calendar. So this tells the story of Felix, who is a trans boy who is still sort of struggling to figure out exactly what his identity is, and in the middle of all this he ends up going through some pretty serious bullying, where a sort of gallery is published on the walls of his school featuring photographs of him pre-transition with his dead name underneath, and he decides to try and out the person that he thinks is behind this attack, and he does this by setting up a kind of fake Instagram account and starting to message this guy, basically trying to create a connection with him so that he will admit that he did it. But then that kind of ends up with this weird like love triangle situation happening when real feelings sort of start to develop along the way, and I really adore this book, hence why I reread it. I gave it 5 stars last time, I gave it 5 stars this time. I think Felix has got a really strong voice that comes through, and I love how messy he is, that like think that he makes questionable decisions throughout this, but you know that his heart is in the right place. And I adore him as a character. And actually I want you to kind of remember that comment for later on, because there is another book that has a character who makes questionable decisions who I just couldn't get behind. So this is a sort of nice version of that. And yeah, I really enjoyed the explorations of identity and how sort of long that can take to actually figure out where you stand and what is right for you, and how that can be ever sort of evolving. I really enjoyed this book and still gave it 5 stars, like I said. So it's always good when you read something that you enjoyed before and it stands up on a reread. So for the prompts that this fulfilled, obviously it is contemporary, it is queer, and it also features POC rep. It's from rereading a comfort read, and it was a TBR prompt. And following on the theme of me reading 5-star predictions, I then read my most anticipated book of the entire year. I say so far, but also just kind of the entire year that I know of at the minute, and that was One Last Stop, a Casey McQuiston. And I am happy to report that this definitely lived up to expectations. I adored this book. This is my favourite book that I read throughout the entire month. We're going to say that now. This month I have a very definite favourite and a very definite least favourite of things that I read throughout the month. This is a very definite favourite. I just adored this. So this tells the story of August, who has just moved to New York, and when she gets there she ends up meeting this girl on the subway who she has a little bit of a crush on. All going well, and then she asks her out and she turns her down very abruptly, and she can't quite figure out why, until she realises that the girl that she has a crush on, called Jane, is actually stuck on the subway and is from the 1970s. It's a bit of a strange story, I'm not going to lie, that sounds really weird. But basically it's part romance with Jane and August. It's part sort of detective story because they're trying to figure out what happened to Jane and why she is stuck on the train. But also a big part of this book, and probably my favourite part of this book, is the idea of found family. Basically August didn't have the sort of easiest time growing up. She had a bit of a strange relationship with her mother, and when she gets to New York she ends up moving into sort of a flat share type situation, and it's the people that she ends up living with as well as some of the other people sort of around them. There's also a diner that she ends up working at, and then also Jane as well, obviously, who kind of become just this big support network and this big family, essentially. All of the side characters were just so strong in their own rights that I loved every time anyone was on the page. It wasn't like you were sort of dying to get back to the romance whenever you were talking to the friends. You wanted to see the friend sequences just as much as you wanted to see the adorable romance between Jane and August. Can you tell I really love this book? I do find sometimes that when I absolutely adore a book, I just can't really talk about it because all I want to say is that I love it, and that is pretty much the case with this one. I would recommend that anybody pick this book up. I love it so much. 5 stars, obviously. And for the prompts that this picked for Whatever You Want It For, the cover is colours of pride flag. It's similar to the lesbian pride flag. We then have 5-star prediction, and it was also hauled this year. From a read that I was really happy lived up to the hype that I'd built up for it, I go to a fairly disappointing read, and that was Tash Hart's Tolstoy by Catherine Ormsby. I actually picked this up this month because of the prompt on my TBR of read something that you've been putting off. And yeah, I bought this a few years ago, just never really got around to reading it. No particular reason why, just has never been one that I've reached for. So I was fairly happy to pick it up this month, and the premise on the back, I'm going to say the premise on the back, seems to be that it is about this girl who creates a web series, a YouTube series, that is a modern day retelling of Anna Karenina. And she has this sort of obsession with Leo Tolstoy. She sort of uses him as her guide in life. And she has been having this sort of flirtatious online relationship with another internet creator. But then when her web series goes a little bit viral and she gets invited to some events and there's a chance that she's actually going to meet him, she has to kind of figure out how to tell him that she identifies as romantic asexual. So that sounds really intriguing. Now the problem is that that wasn't actually the storyline, or it was, but just for a very small amount of it. So this actually had about 5 different storylines going on that it couldn't seem to decide which one it wanted to focus on. The storyline about Tash identifying as romantic asexual didn't actually come into play till over 100 pages in. I think it was the first time it was actually mentioned. And the storyline of her meeting up with this guy, I think, was in the last 100 pages. And it's an almost 400 page book. So there's 200 pages in the middle of this just sort of not really progressing at all. And in the meantime, we have storylines about, right, what do we have? We have something about her wanting to go to college but not sure if she'll actually be able to get in. We have something about sister family drama that was never really resolved, so I don't really know what happened there. We have some best friend drama. We have, best friend's parents have got an illness as well. What else do we have? We then have the actual show being made and issues with the actors for that because some of them used to date each other, and that was very briefly a drama. There was also then another relationship that she was possibly going to be in. There was just lots and lots of little things that seemed like they could have been the main focus, but none of them actually were the main focus. And yeah, I mean, I gave it 3 stars. I didn't completely hate it. I think all the storylines that they brought in had potential to be really good. It's just that none of them really got their chance to shine. So they were all just a bit meh. But I'm glad that I finally read it, because at least now it's not going to be just sat on my shelves unread. I'm probably going to be unhauling this one soon, but at least one less one on my TBR shelf. That's the way I'm seeing it. And for prompts, Whatever You Want It For, this one actually only covered 2, so this was TBR prompt, and I managed to find it on some bookish creators' favourites. I sort of basically searched for the title on YouTube and found a couple of videos where it was on people's favourites from that year. I was like, yeah, that counts. I just wanted to make sure I got some points for it because I'd managed to read it. Next, I went on to read You're the One That I Want by Simon James Green. So again, this is one that I kind of went into thinking it was slightly different than what it actually was, but this one was entirely my fault because I didn't really read the synopsis. But the title of it made me think Greece, and I think I'd heard somewhere it was a Greece retelling, which it isn't. It does feature Greece because they're putting it on as the sort of school play. But it's about this kid called Freddie who feels like he's just sort of not really got anything really going for him. He feels like he's a little bit forgettable, and especially because his mum is working as a TV producer on this teen show, and he sort of ends up going to a party and meeting all these other beautiful teenagers who he feels like he kind of pales in comparison to, and he ends up having a fairly embarrassing incident with one of them as well at that party. So on the back of that, he decides that, or his friends decide actually, that he needs to start saying yes to things. He needs to start saying yes to any opportunity that comes his way, and that will help to improve his life. So that leads to him auditioning for the school play. There's also a new boy in school that he ends up sort of flirting with and starting a relationship with, and it's just kind of about that, essentially. It's just about that relationship. There's some boy drama that goes on. It's about Freddie sort of finding himself and sort of becoming this new Freddie and becoming more confident. It was a really cute story. I've read a few things by Simon James Green now. The first book I read of his I actually didn't like. It was No, I Can't Even. But then I read Heartbreak Boys last year that I enjoyed, and then this one I enjoyed even more. So I'm glad that I'm starting to like his writing more and more. I'm hoping that it carries on in that direction. I gave this one 4 stars, and I will definitely read more from him again in the future. And for prompts, this features my team colour, because obviously it is a very blue book. And it also, there was a prompt that was the first letter of your current read has to be the last letter of your previous read. So Tash Hart's Tolstoy ends with a Y. You're the One That I Want starts with a Y. Managed to do that one. And it was also Hauled in the Last Year. You'll notice I used Hauled in the Last Year a lot because it was an easy one, because I read a lot of new books. The next one I don't actually have to hold up, so I will insert a picture here, but it is Jay's Gay Agenda by Jason June. I really enjoyed this one. I listened to the audiobook, hence why I don't have it here to hold at the minute. And it basically is about a kid called Jay who moves to a new city, having sort of previously grown up in a small town, and he has this list of things that he wants to do now he's got to this big city, and it's called his Gay Agenda, and it's basically experiences he wants to have, like to go on his first date and have his first kiss, and just basically actually be able to act on his romantic feelings, as opposed to being in a small town where there weren't many other gay people that he could pursue. But in kind of completing this list, he ends up getting in a little bit of trouble, partly because he ends up kind of neglecting his friends from home now that he's moved to this new place, but also because there may be a couple of different boys that he could complete different things on this list with, and that's not going to go down too well. And I do know that actually some of the reviews for this book do have issues with this, because there is definitely some cheating going on in the story. I will say that if that's something that you're sensitive to, I wouldn't read it. I would say that the cheating is discussed fairly early on about how can it be classed as cheating, because it's a failure to define a relationship, and which, I mean, take from that as you will. I will say that I don't think he necessarily gets away with it. There is anger when it's found out, but I can understand why some people just can't get behind that in a book at all. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed Jay's character. I found him really fun to listen to, I suppose, because I didn't sort of physically read it. Actually, the audiobook for this was really good as well, which helps obviously. And yeah, I was able to just sort of listen to this in a few trips to and from the office going into work. I was listening to it on my commute, so it was a good read. So it fulfilled a few different prompts. So it was actually a poll pick. I put a poll in the Whateverthon Discord, and this was the one that won. It also is a debut, and I hauled it technically in the last year. Oh, and I don't know if I actually said, but I gave that one 4 stars as well. I then listened to another audiobook on the way in and out of work, and that was Between Perfect and Real by Ray Stoev. This one is about a trans boy who isn't out to anyone yet, and especially isn't out to his girlfriend, who believes him to be a lesbian girl, essentially. And the way that it's kind of then brought to light that he is trans is that he gets cast as Romeo in the school play, and that kind of spurs him on to sort of consider his identity a little bit more and deciding to sort of come out to everyone in his life. And it's basically just about that sort of act of them putting on the play and everyone kind of finding out about his identity and how different people handle it. I ended up giving this one about a 3.5 stars. I did enjoy parts of it. I also had some issues with it. Some of my issues were just with the audiobook, but I didn't sort of rate the overall book down for that. What I will say though is that if you are considering the audiobook, there is a character in this who is supposed to be English, and it's one of the worst English accents that I've ever heard. It was just not good. It kept switching and changing between different dialects, and no. It was also a little bit, I don't know, the rhythm of it just threw me off a little bit. It was, the writing style was very sort of staccato, and in the way that it was delivered in the audiobook, you could almost hear every sentence was being said like this, and it was just a little bit too, it took me out of it. I like something to flow a little bit more. So basically one of the issues that I actually did have with the story was to do with how one character in particular sort of dealt with their feelings about the main character Dean coming out, and how those feelings were then sort of reacted to, because it was all told from Dean's point of view. So if there was any sort of questions or adjustments that someone had when they found out this information. It was obviously taken in a very negative way because they just wanted acceptance, but then it also meant that there was characters that had sort of like legitimate reasons for being a little bit shocked and maybe needing a bit more time to adjust and almost just get used to the idea that something is different than what they believed it to be. Weren't really given that time to sort of explore their emotions because it was very quickly sort of moved on from that they were like demonized almost, and you never really saw those characters grow. And I think that it would have been a better, more well-rounded story if you would have been able to sort of see more of a resolution of those conflicts, if that makes sense. It's a hard one to explain without going into spoilers, but there was one particular character that I felt like I would have liked to have seen like a little bit more sort of well-roundedness to their story by the end of it. And if you are interested in sort of what it is I'm trying to get at here, I went on the Goodreads reviews after, and most of the sort of criticisms of this book seem to be along the lines of what I'm trying to get at without going into spoilers. So if you are interested and you're not bothered about spoilers, I suggest you go and have a look on there. So the next book that I read, and the last physical book that I read during the month, was Hani and Ishu's Guide to Fake Dating by Adiba Jagada. So this one features two girls who, one of them has just come out as bisexual, and her friends basically don't believe her because they say that because she's never been with a girl, she can't possibly be bisexual. The other one is also bisexual but isn't out to anyone yet, and she basically wants to become more popular so that she can be considered for head girl in the school that they are both in. And the one who has just come out to her friends basically ends up lying and saying that she is dating the other one. So it ends up being that they decide to agree to a fake dating relationship in order to kind of help each other out, because Hani has the popular friends that Ishu needs to become head girl, and Ishu is the girl that Hani needs to date in order for her friends to believe that she's bi. And obviously you can guess that this does eventually lead to some real romance going on in there. I will say that actually a lot of this book isn't about the romance. That was one of the things that I wasn't necessarily expecting when I went into this. It's actually a lot about identities, both from sort of a queer identity point of view, where obviously you've already heard there's definitely some biphobia in here, but also about race and cultural identities as well, because both of the main characters, as you can see from the front, are not white and they live in a predominantly white country. These are two Bengali girls who live in Ireland, and essentially Hani's best friends do a lot of questionable things, from being fairly sort of like casual racism to just full-blown blatant in-your-face racism, and a lot of it is about that and the discussions of that as well. And I found that to be really, really interesting. I really loved the sort of conversations that were had throughout this book. I found it to be a nice balance of sort of hard-hitting but also then fairly cute. Although I will say that the way that it was sort of like split up almost is that you had them sort of setting up this fake dating, and then very quickly they realised they had crushes on each other, and then there was drama that kind of completely took over for a while, and then it went back to the dating. And I just feel like it could have been a bit more interspersed throughout, because it felt like, oh, suddenly we're back to the romance again then, and just sort of took me out of it a little bit. But I did really enjoy it, and I would like to read more by this author. I'm hopefully going to pick up the Henna Wars soon, and anything else that she comes out with afterwards. And for prompts, this one fulfilled Hold in the Last Year, POC Rep, and a TBR game prompt. And then the next book that I have to talk about is May the Best Man Win by Z.R. Ella. I'm not going to talk too much about this one because I just really didn't enjoy it, and I don't like talking about books that I didn't enjoy. But I listened to the audiobook of this. I will admit that I zoned out for a fair amount of it, because very early on I could not get behind either of these main characters. Basically it is about two boys who, one of them is trans, and they actually used to date before one of them came out. I can't even remember his name. I want to say it was Jeremy. And they have a little bit of a complicated relationship since then, and basically they are both competing against each other for Homecoming King, and it's kind of about the horrible things that they do to each other whilst trying to compete, and also about their sort of love story and them realising whether or not they still want to be together now that one of them has transitioned, and sort of the other one figuring out what his identity is, because he's not sure how he feels about this person that he thought was a girl and it was actually a guy. Anyway, my issues were that basically both of these main characters were just horrible people. Like, they did some awful stuff to each other throughout it. The sort of the voices of the characters, not from like an audio point of view, but the actual voices that were written, just were very sort of dramatic and came across very hateful and just not nice to read about at all, really. And the author has said that he wanted to write a story about a trans character who wasn't perfect, and it didn't have to be this perfect person to deserve love. Absolutely fine. I'm fine with that. As I said, I read Felix Ever After earlier on in the month, and he did some questionable things in setting up this fake relationship with this guy. Like, he definitely made some decisions that I could not get behind. But overall, I could feel for the character. I could root for him. I can't root for these characters in this book. I just found it really, really difficult. And by the time it got to the end of it and they were sort of having their, like, and everything was nice and wrapped up, I just didn't care. So I know I said I wasn't going to say much about this book, but I feel like I've been ranting now. But basically, I gave it 2 stars. It was fine. Yeah, not for me. But for prompts, I counted it for debut. It has the colours of the trans flag on the front cover, so it reminded me of the pride flag. And there was some disability rep in here as well. And then the last book that I read was an ebook, and that was The Summer of Everything by Julian Winters. This one is a fairly simple, fairly cute story about the main character called Wes, and he works in a bookstore that is possibly going to close down due to lack of business, and basically decides to spend the summer trying to drum up more business so that the store can stay open. In between that, it is also about his crush on his best friend Nico, and they're all going off to college. So that's the thing, it's all set around sort of their last summer before they all go off to college. There's a group of them that work in this bookstore, and it's, yeah, about his crush on his best friend and also sort of various other things with the other members of staff at the bookstore. And there's not much else to it. It's a fairly, like I said, a simple story. It's just a cute little love story basically, and it's also got like a little bit of a love letter to books in there, because obviously it is set in a bookshop, so there's a lot of references to other authors. I'm guessing the sort of the author Julian Winters is probably friends with, because it was a lot of like current day YA authors that were mentioned, which was really cute. There's also like a big talk about comic books in there a lot. It's a, like I said, it's a cute book. That's probably the best way to describe it. I gave it 3 stars. It was kind of nothing spectacular. I wanted to love it more than I did, I think, but I enjoyed it enough for what it was. I'll still read more from this author. I just would like there to be a little bit more happening in the story, because I did get a little bit bored at times. But in general, I did enjoy it. So that is everything that I read during this month. It is all of these plus the, 4 more that I listened to or read as an ebook. And yeah, I'm feeling pretty good about this. I've got a couple of new favourites. I reread an old favourite. There was definitely a couple that I didn't enjoy too much as well. In terms of Whateverthon, I did complete all 15 of the prompts. Actually, I've just realised I never told you what the prompts were for the last book. The last one was an indie published book. Featured a POC main character, and it also featured the colour of my team on the cover as well. It had blue for where the author's name was. But yeah, I mean, managed to do all 15 of the prompts, a couple of them a few times. And yeah, I read 12 books when I planned to read 10, so that meant that was a deity for the team. And I finished on 8,750 points, which isn't the most I've seen online, most definitely, but I'm quite happy with that. I'm just glad that I managed to beat my goals, and I'm glad that in general I had a good reading month. Like I said, I read some new favourites and reread some old, and that's always fun to do. So I think that's everything to talk about today. I know this has been a bit of a rambly video. I did not expect it to be this long. Hopefully it's a bit shorter when I edit it. But thank you guys for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff down below. You'll find links to all my social media down there as well. I've been a lot more active on my Twitter this week. I'm starting to actually use it. So please have a chat with me if you would like to. I'd love to talk to you all. And I will see you next time with a rather large book haul. Bye.